Do you know someone like this? Talks like a genius and acts like an idiot. People packed with arguments, packed with certainty, but with zero common sense. Smart people who use their own brain to justify stupid decisions. And the worst part? They influence others, they lead, they dominate conversations, and they make choices that affect everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you why smart people become stupid and how that might be one of the biggest dangers of our time, because stupidity doesn't always come from ignorance. Sometimes it comes from too much confidence. We live in the information age, an era where access to knowledge is one click away. But here's the loud, obvious paradox. We've never been so connected to information, and at the same time, so blinded by our own confidence in it. Brilliant minds make disastrous choices every day. Trained professionals, respected intellectuals, gifted young people. Everyone, at some point, falls into what Socrates warned about more than 2,000 years ago, the illusion of knowing. I know that I know nothing. That line isn't fake modesty. It's the foundation of real wisdom. Socrates wasn't a hopeless skeptic. He believed in the value of searching for knowledge. But he also knew the biggest obstacle to learning isn't ignorance. It's the belief that you already know. And that's the subtle poison that can infect even the sharpest minds. Unexamined certainty. The "I already know this." The quiet pride of someone who thinks they've figured out the world. This mental trap is so common that modern psychology has a name for it: the Dunning-Kruger effect. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a study that became a major reference. They showed that the less someone knows about a subject, the more likely they are to overestimate their knowledge. And there's more. People with low skill often struggle to recognize their own lack of skill. They don't know what they don't know. But here's the most alarming part. This doesn't only happen to ignorant people. It can hit smart people too, because the more you learn, the more you're exposed to the risk of arrogance. When we master one field, it's easy to lose awareness of our limits in other areas. Think about the doctor who assumes they understand politics just because they spent years studying science. Or the economist talking about education like they're an expert. Knowledge in one area can create a false sense of authority over everything. That's where the intelligent, stupid person is born. And this isn't a moral attack. It's a structural criticism of how we relate to knowledge. Learning about the world is noble, but falling in love with our own knowledge, that's the danger. Because knowledge without humility inflates the ego, but it doesn't transform the person. Confucius, the great Chinese teacher, already said something like this: knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, that is wisdom. For Confucius, real knowledge requires inner discipline, character building, and ongoing humility. He didn't see knowledge as collecting information, but as refining the human being. If knowledge doesn't come with virtue, it turns into vanity. And that's exactly what we see in many of today's casual intellectuals. People who collect degrees, titles, or followers, but use knowledge to dominate, not to understand. They talk a lot and listen very little. They mock other people's doubts while hiding behind fragile certainties. Have you seen that? A discussion where someone raises their voice, name drops authors, throws out jargon, but deep down, they just want to win the argument, not understand the other person. That isn't wisdom. It's vanity dressed up as intelligence. This illusion has serious consequences. Think about historical moments where this arrogance of knowledge produced tragedy. Eugenics in the 20th century, pushed by scientists who believed they were serving biology and racial purity. Financial bubbles created by Wall Street geniuses who thought they had mastered the market. Technocratic political decisions that ignore real human experience, because experts believe they already know what's best for everyone. These are not examples of uneducated people. These are examples of informed, often brilliant people who are blinded by too much confidence in their own understanding. And in everyday life, it happens too. Talking to a friend, debating in class, commenting online. How often do we argue not to understand, but to prove we're right? How often do we use knowledge like a weapon instead of a bridge? That's the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems. Wisdom is the ability to recognize the limits of what you know. As a Zen saying goes, when the cup is full, there's no room for more tea. When we're full of certainty, there's no space for listening, surprise, or learning. The arrogant intellectual already has an answer for everything, even when the answers are wrong. The Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset warned that one of modernity's biggest risks was the rise of the educated mass man, someone with access to knowledge who never integrates it into life. A kind of enlightened ignorance. And that leads to a powerful lesson. Real knowledge begins when you admit your ignorance. That isn't fake humility. It's courage. It's openness to the world. It's being able to say, I don't know. I might be wrong. The other person might teach me something, because only those who recognize their limits can move beyond them. What Socrates' philosophy, Dunning and Kruger's psychology, and Confucius's ethics all teach is this: knowledge without humility becomes a distorted mirror. It doesn't show us the world as it is. It only shows us our own reflection, enlarged. And in a world like ours, filled with experts, gurus, influencers, and easy certainties, this illusion spreads like a shadow. How often do important conversations get shut down by phrases like, I've read a lot about this. I know. You don't understand. I studied this. This is basic. You should know. Those lines don't open dialogue. They end it. And that closing off is where intellectual stupidity begins, because knowledge that seals itself off starts to rot. So maybe the most important question is, where in my life do I believe I know more than I actually do? That's the beginning of wisdom. It's not about being dumb or smart. It's about being real, grounded, honest, and open. Because in the end, the danger isn't the person who openly admits they don't know. The danger is the person who confuses education with enlightenment and intelligence with truth. And as Socrates, who never wrote a book but taught the world, kept reminding us, true wisdom is recognizing your own ignorance. Not all knowledge brings light. Sometimes it blinds. Not all intelligence sets you free. Sometimes it traps you. One of the biggest dangers that follows brilliant minds is something the person experiencing it rarely notices: intellectual pride. It's the arrogance of someone who believes they've defeated ignorance, and because of that, refuses to listen, rethink, or learn. It's subtle, quiet, and destructive. It's the trap that turns geniuses into tyrants of reason. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the will to power. Not just political or physical power, but the power of knowledge, the urge to impose, to convince, to dominate others through ideas. Nietzsche saw intellectual pride as a kind of weakness disguised as strength. When someone uses their intelligence like a shield against the world, they close themselves off to anything new, push away criticism, and look down on what's different. The mind becomes a tower, tall, impressive, and lonely. This kind of arrogance creates what Nietzsche called a reactive spirit, a mind that doesn't create, it only reacts, fights, and defends itself. An intelligence that, instead of expanding, becomes bitter, rigid, and resentful. And this isn't just in philosophers, scientists, or academics, it's in us. Every time we use our knowledge to silence someone instead of listening. Every time we say, that's obvious. You're wrong. Only an idiot would think that. Those are signs of a mind that isn't trying to understand anymore. It's just trying to prove how smart it is. The problem is, intellectual pride is rarely visible to the person carrying it, because it hides behind logic, certainty, and being right. But underneath, there's fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of not being as smart as you think you are. Fear of giving in. Laozi, the Taoist master, gives a powerful image for this. Wisdom is like water. It flows, it adapts, it softens without resisting. Intellectual arrogance, on the other hand, is stone, hard, inflexible, controlling. In the Tao Te Ching, the true wise person doesn't try to control or win debates. They seek harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of reality. When you cling to rigid structures, hard ideas, and final truths, you move away from the path. Water defeats stone not by force, but by patience, by flexibility. And maybe the same is true for thinking, because intellectual pride makes us confuse rigidity with strength. We think keeping an opinion unchanged is proof of power, when it can actually be proof of fear, vanity, or insecurity. Francis Bacon, the 17th century thinker and a father of modern scientific method, warned about the idols of the mind, and among them, one of the most dangerous is the idol of the cave. This idol represents personal biases, habits and distortions shaped by our history, culture and language. According to Bacon, even intellectuals, scholars and scientists, maybe especially them, are vulnerable to these inner idols. They live inside mental caves, projecting shadows of what they think is truth, and the more confident they are, the less they notice how much their ideas are shaped by unconscious filters. Sound familiar? Think about online debates. How often does a discussion turn into an ego war? How often does someone comment on an article or video just to show they know more? Disagreeing isn't the problem. The problem is debating without listening, criticizing without understanding, turning dialogue into a duel. Because intellectual pride does that. It dehumanizes the other person. It reduces them to a wrong idea, and it turns your own mind into the final judge of truth. Now think for a second. How many times have you stopped listening to someone because you felt they weren't on your level? How many times has someone tried to teach you something and you dismissed it with a superior smile? Those small gestures are symptoms of intellectual arrogance, and it gets worse when knowledge becomes a status symbol. We live in a society where degrees, books, job titles and followers are treated like medals, and the danger is starting to believe that knowing more means being better. But it doesn't. Knowing more can make you more dangerous, more skilled at manipulating, more clever at justifying your mistakes, more effective at hiding your own ignorance. That's why so many intelligent people become foolish. They use their mind like a bunker, not like a window. And this pride doesn't only affect individuals, it can affect entire civilizations. History is full of empires that collapsed because they trusted their own knowledge too much. Imperial Rome, ignoring warnings and threats at its borders. Parts of the elite during the French Revolution, looking down on the people. Technocratic governments that believed they had perfect formulas and pushed nations into chaos. Intellectual arrogance doesn't just blind, it destroys. So what can we do? Maybe the antidote is exactly where the great teachers pointed. Nietzsche wasn't defending ignorance. He wanted people to overcome limits. But he knew the mind must be free, not vain. Laozi wasn't rejecting knowledge, but attachment to knowledge. He taught the value of emptying yourself. Bacon wasn't condemning reason. He was calling for constant self-checking against our mental blind spots. Know yourself, said the inscription at the Oracle of Delphi. And maybe that self-knowledge includes admitting that even a brilliant mind is full of traps, admitting that reason has limits, that even the most logical argument can carry emotional motives, and that the other person, even without titles, even with simple ideas, may still have something to teach us. Because real intelligence isn't the kind that wins debates. It's the kind that builds bridges. It recognizes that every light creates a shadow, and that no mind, no matter how sharp, is free from error. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is also the one making the most destructive decisions. Not because they can't think, but because they're emotionally disconnected. A common mistake in modern life is believing that reason and emotion are opposites, and that to be rational, we have to suppress our feelings. But human history and philosophy suggest the opposite. A mind that ignores its emotions is headed straight toward irrationality. The Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century said, "Reason is, and ought to be, the slave of the passions." That line shocked many thinkers back then, and even today it makes people uncomfortable. Isn't reason supposed to be in control? But what Hume is showing is simple and deep. We don't decide with the mind alone. We decide with the heart. Even the most rational choices have emotional motives underneath them. We choose to study, work, fight, love, not just because it makes sense, but because something inside us wants, fears, hopes. Reason by itself doesn't move anyone. It only organizes the path. The drive comes from emotion. And it's exactly when we ignore that, when we pretend we're purely logical beings, that we start acting in foolish ways. Because an emotion you deny doesn't disappear. It hides, and it comes back wearing a mask, often as pride, rigidity, or harsh judgment. How many debates, political decisions, or life choices have a rational surface, but underneath are driven by fear, envy, insecurity, vanity? Pure intelligence doesn't protect us from mistakes. In fact, it can make a deeply irrational choice look logical. Like building a bomb and calling it security. Like humiliating someone and calling it justice. Like manipulating data and calling it science. Hume teaches that reason serves our emotions. That's why we have to learn to understand our emotions. Ignoring them is like walking around with a perfect map, but not knowing where you are. Centuries earlier, Plato already saw this conflict inside the human heart. In his theory of the soul, he said our psyche has three parts. The rational part, which seeks truth and the good. The spirited part, tied to courage, honor, and anger. The appetitive part, linked to desires, pleasures, and impulses. For Plato, a balanced soul is like a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble and strong, the other wild and rebellious. Reason is the driver, trying to guide both in harmony. But when one horse takes over, when desire explodes or anger takes control, the driver loses the reins, and the chariot, which is our life, goes off track. Plato wasn't saying emotions are bad. He recognized their vital role. The problem is imbalance, when reason becomes weak or deaf, or when it tries to control feelings like a tyrant. That imbalance is what makes brilliant minds commit ugly mistakes. Reason that doesn't listen to the heart becomes cold, cruel, and inhuman. And a heart that rejects reason becomes impulsive, chaotic, and self-destructive. We have to learn how to talk to our emotions, understand them, name them, make space for them, like a good leader listening to their soldiers before choosing a strategy. The Buddha, in his own way, pointed to the root of human suffering: attachment, blind desire, unconscious fear, repressed anger. These come from emotional ignorance. For the Buddha, real wisdom isn't just intellectual. It grows from deep self-knowledge, paying close attention to emotions, thoughts, inner reactions, and recognizing that pain doesn't come only from events, but from how we respond to them. The mind is everything. What you think, you become. Buddha. And if the mind is everything, denying your emotions is denying yourself. So this split between reason and emotion isn't really real. It's a cultural idea that taught us feeling is weakness and thinking is strength. But the truth is more subtle. Feeling without thinking is chaos. Thinking without feeling is emptiness. Now bring this into real life. How many times have you seen a very intelligent person justify clearly toxic behavior with perfect logic? How many cold, technical, rational speeches are really hiding emotional wounds that were never healed? And it's not just other people, it's us too. Think of a decision you made rationally, but deep down it was driven by fear or pride. Maybe you turned down an opportunity with logical reasons, but it was really insecurity. Or you ended a relationship because of incompatibility, when what hurt most was the fear of truly opening up. These decisions are human, but they become dangerous when we refuse to admit what's behind them. Because intellectual pride often stops us from admitting we feel, and then we lose control without noticing. That's why philosophy, psychology, and spirituality all meet at the same point. Emotional self-awareness is a core part of wisdom. This isn't about letting emotions run your life. It's about being close to them, understanding what drives you, what freezes you, what blinds you. Reason shouldn't fight emotion. It should listen to it, balance it, and integrate it. When that happens, real wisdom is born, the kind that sees clearly, feels deeply, and acts with balance. Because in the end, we're not thinking machines. We're human beings, full of contradictions, doubts, wounds, and desires. Ignoring that isn't rationality, it's disconnection. As Carl Jung, echoing Buddha and Hume, put it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. A philosophy of emotion isn't about being overly sensitive. It's about being real, about understanding that the strongest kind of intelligence is the kind that includes the heart. We live in a time where knowledge seems to be everywhere, but a sense of meaning, belonging, and real connection to life is getting rarer and rarer. Universities train specialists, companies hire for technical mastery. Social media rewards people who know a lot, about almost nothing. And what's the result? Razor-sharp minds that no longer know what they're thinking for. That's where the danger of intellectual alienation begins. When knowledge pulls away from real life, when knowledge becomes a product, a tool, and loses its soul. Karl Marx called this alienation, not only in an economic sense, but also an intellectual one. For Marx, a human being only fully becomes themselves when their work, and their thinking, is connected to their essence, their community, and the world. But in capitalism, knowledge gets broken into pieces. It turns into symbolic capital. The worker loses control over what they produce, and the intellectual loses the meaning of what they think. That's why you see so many brilliant professionals living empty lives. Because they know a lot, but don't know why. Because they study deeply, but don't know for whom. Knowledge becomes an end in itself, a sterile specialization disconnected from social, human, and emotional reality. And the saddest part is that many people mistake this for success. The doctor who no longer looks patients in the eye only reads test results. The lawyer who defends inhuman laws with technical arguments. The engineer who builds cities with no soul, just spreadsheets, all highly trained and completely disconnected. That's what Marx wanted to warn against, a world where even thinking becomes a commodity, and the thinker no longer thinks about the world, only about their small sector, their bubble, their career. In the 20th century, Martin Heidegger warned about this disconnection too, but in a more existential way, through technology. For him, modern life fell into a way of thinking he called technological framing, Gestell. Everything, the world, other people, even ourselves, starts to look like a resource, something to measure, calculate, and control. Technical intelligence replaces lived wisdom, efficiency replaces meaning, and the human being becomes a cog. Heidegger wasn't against technology. He was against the technical mindset spreading into everything. When we relate to the world like it's just a machine, something to optimize, predict, and use, we lose the mystery of existence. That's why so many people look successful on the outside and feel empty on the inside. They were trained to produce, compete, and specialize, but not to exist. They know how to operate a machine, but they don't know how to handle silence. They know numbers, reports, and tools, but not fear, doubt, or death. That's modern alienation. Being able to launch satellites into space, but unable to listen to your own child. Building skyscrapers, but living in an inner desert. Being a master of algorithms and a beginner at love. And don't think this is only a problem for academic elites. This disconnection is in all of us. How often do we feel useless because we're not specialists? How often do we treat philosophy, art, or spirituality like a waste of time because it's not practical? That's the victory of utilitarian knowledge, a kind of knowledge that only values what produces profit, productivity, and efficiency. Zhuangzi, a Taoist sage from ancient China, warned against this more than 2,000 years ago. In his writings, He said the truly wise person doesn't cling to fixed categories. He laughs at labels, plays with concepts, questions certainty. Zhuangzi believed that overly useful knowledge traps the mind because it forces us to see the world like a tool, not like a mystery. A person who clings to a single point of view limits themselves. Zhuangzi. While modern society glorifies the specialist, the Tao invites us to be wide, free, adaptable, like nature, like water, like the wind that changes with the seasons. A wise mind doesn't stay trapped inside usefulness. It dances with the unexpected. It contemplates. It allows itself not to know. And maybe that's what we're missing today. Space to not know. We stay so busy trying to be useful, productive, relevant, that we forget to feel, to observe, to exist. Zhuangzi tells a story about a crooked tree that was useless, good for neither lumber nor shade, but because it was useless, it lived. No one cut it down. It stayed there, crooked, useless, and free. That story challenges us. What if real knowledge is the kind that doesn't serve anything except setting us free? Over-specialization makes us lose the bigger picture. It trains us to be parts. It pulls us away from the poetry of life. And that distance has a cost. People becoming smarter, but unable to find meaning. Societies becoming more advanced, but also more anxious, lonely, and sick. What Marx, Heidegger, and Zhuangzi are all saying, in their own ways, is this: knowledge must return to serving life. It has to reconnect with the human, with existence, with mystery. That doesn't mean abandoning technical, scientific, or professional knowledge. It means reintegrating it into a bigger project of being, living with awareness, thinking with the body, with the heart, with the soul, not only with the brain. Because knowledge that never touches the world becomes noise. Knowledge that never asks about being becomes a tool with no direction. And knowledge that doesn't recognize its own limits becomes arrogance. As Pascal put it, man is neither angel nor beast, and the worst is that wanting to be an angel, he becomes a beast. So maybe the greatest act of intelligence today is to learn how to feel again, to look at the world with less technical eyes and more human ones, less focused on usefulness and more on existence. The mind is like a window. It only lets in light if it stays open. But how often, even among very intelligent people, do we run into closed minds? People who studied, read, debated, and still ended up trapped inside one fixed idea, unable to hear anything that challenges their beliefs. That's the poison of ideological dogmatism. It doesn't matter if it's political, religious, academic, or moral. Dogmatism is the invisible prison of thought, and worse, it's a prison the prisoner defends as if it were freedom. John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher from the 19th century, warned about this. The only way to keep a true idea alive is to let it be constantly questioned. Mill believed freedom of thought isn't just a right, it's something reason needs to survive. Even strong ideas rot if they're never tested. Even the most beautiful truths, without opposition, turn into empty slogans. And this is especially true for intelligent people. The more you know, the greater the risk of arrogance, believing you found the final answer, turning convictions into trenches, and treating every criticism like a threat. That's how even brilliant minds become dogmatic, not from ignorance, but from too much certainty. How many thinkers have fallen into this trap? How many leaders, activists, theorists, intellectuals turned ideas into idols? History is full of examples. People who, in the name of ideologies, even good ones, stopped listening to others, denied how complex the world is, and committed injustice in the name of principles they called truth. Dogmatism usually grows like this. First, you believe something with passion. Then you stop listening to people who disagree. Then you start looking down on them. And in the end, you don't think anymore. You just repeat. You defend, attack, and survive. Thought becomes a bunker, and what should be dialogue turns into war. Ibn Rushd, the great Muslim philosopher of the 12th century, also known as Averroes, saw this danger clearly. He was a bridge between Islam, Christianity, and Greek philosophy, and he defended a bold idea. Reason must dialogue with faith. For Averroes, religious dogmatism was a betrayal of the spirit of philosophy. Faith without reason becomes superstition, and reason without humility becomes arrogance. He believed sacred texts should be read with depth, through reasoning, openness, and nuance. Because truth doesn't scream, it whispers. And only those who think can hear it. The dogmatic person, on the other hand, doesn't think, they repeat. They quote verses, doctrines, statistics, data, but they don't listen. They protect themselves from the discomfort of changing, and they confuse loyalty with rigidity. Ibn Rushd lived in a time of persecution and intolerance. He saw philosophy being banned in the name of faith, but he held his ground. The search for truth requires openness, and where there is fear of thinking, there is tyranny. Today, dogmatism may not live only in temple. It lives on social media, in universities, in political groups, anywhere someone says, if you don't think like me, you're wrong, or you're the enemy. And that can come from the right or the left, from religious people and atheists, from progressives and conservatives. Dogmatism doesn't pick a side. It feeds on the feeling of being right and the terror of being wrong. But what's so threatening about changing your mind? Why are we so afraid of another point of view? The answer is one word: identity. A lot of the time, our ideas become part of who we are. We believe in them so deeply that letting them go feels like losing a piece of ourselves. That's why arguments aren't only rational, they're emotional. Because behind every argument there's a story, a pain, a fear, a desire to belong. But the truly wise person isn't afraid of losing ideas, because they know truth isn't something you own, it's something you chase. Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher of the Madhyamaka tradition, went even further. All fixed beliefs are illusion. For him, wisdom is the middle way. Every point of view is conditioned. Every doctrine is limited. Every concept is empty by nature. That doesn't mean nothing matters. It means no idea is absolute. Holding on to a truth too tightly is exactly what stops us from seeing beyond it. Nagarjuna challenged every closed system. He showed that words are like fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon. So the path of wisdom, for him, is non-attachment. Yes, have ideas, but don't become their prisoner. Use thought like a tool, not like a cage. That can feel unsettling, and it is. But it's also freeing, because what truly imprisons us isn't doubt. It's blind certainty. It's the pride of being right. It's the fear of listening to someone else. And if there's one thing that connects Mill, Averroes, and Nagarjuna, it's the belief that the mind needs space to grow, to make mistakes, to listen, and to change. In a polarized world like ours, that sounds like heresy, because we're taught to pick a side, take a stance, and fight. But what would happen if, instead of reacting, we listened? If we asked, why does the other person think that? What haven't I considered yet? What if I'm partly wrong? What if there's another angle? Those questions don't weaken us. They humanize us. Because nobody sees the whole picture. Each mind is a window, and the world is an endless landscape. And maybe the greatest strength of thought isn't shouting truths, but whispering doubts. Not all ignorance comes from a lack of access to knowledge. Sometimes, ignorance is a choice. And what's most interesting is that this choice can be made by very intelligent people. People who can understand, analyze, and argue. But when faced with uncomfortable truths, they'd rather look away. This is subtle. It's not about being dumb. It's something deeper, more psychological and existential, refusing to see what threatens our identity, our comfort, or the image we have of ourselves. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the major voices of existentialism, called this bad faith, mauvaise foi. For Sartre, bad faith happens when we lie to ourselves, not because we're being fooled, but because we become the ones doing the fooling. Bad faith is that moment when you know something is wrong, but you choose to pretend everything is fine. It's the quiet decision not to think too much, not to go deeper, not to change. For example, the employee who hates their job but tells themselves they're lucky, the partner who feels the love is gone but keeps up appearances, the citizen who sees social injustice but blames others so they don't have to face their own responsibility. These are acts of bad faith, and they're often practiced by educated, rational, articulate people. Because intelligence doesn't protect you from running away from the truth. Sometimes it only makes the escape more sophisticated. As Sartre would say, we are condemned to be free, meaning there's no excuse for pretending we didn't choose. Every gesture, every silence, every escape is a decision. And when we choose not to see, that ignorance isn't innocent. It's voluntary, calculated, emotionally convenient. But why do we do this? The answer may be found in another brilliant thinker, Blaise Pascal, a 17th century French philosopher, mathematician, scientist, and mystic. Pascal understood something deep about human nature. The heart has reasons that reason itself does not know. That line is often misunderstood as something romantic, but it actually points to a real tension between thought and feeling. Pascal knew we aren't purely rational, and many times we choose ignorance not because we're stupid, but because we're emotionally fragile. We choose not to think about death because it scares us. We choose not to question our beliefs because they comfort us. We choose not to face our contradictions because they shake us. In that sense, voluntary ignorance is a form of protection, a cocoon made of justifications, distractions, routines, and even a powerful mind can struggle to break through that veil. Pascal saw this with compassion, not as an accusation, but as an honest picture of what it means to be human. And that's why he argued for a living faith that doesn't reject reason, but recognizes its limits. Here's where Pascal and Sartre meet on a key point. Truth requires courage. Courage to feel, courage to change, courage to lose certainty. But there's another perspective, more spiritual, more subtle, that goes even deeper. The Indian philosophy of Shankara. For Shankara, the root of suffering is avidya, ignorance. And this ignorance isn't just missing information. It's confusing what's real with what's not. It's forgetting our true nature. In Advaita Vedanta, the philosophical tradition Shankara represents, we live under the veil of Maya, illusion, the illusion of separation, the illusion of a fixed identity, the illusion of control, ownership, permanence. And as long as we're caught in that illusion, we mistake the temporary for the eternal, the superficial for the essential, the ego for the true self. Here, ignorance isn't just theoretical, it's existential. We live as if we are only this body, this name, this story. And that's why we suffer. That's why we fear. That's why we resist truth. Shankara's proposal is radical. It's not enough to accumulate knowledge. You have to undo the mind's false stories. And that only happens through self-knowledge, by looking inward, by moving past I think and finding I am, by recognizing that much of our ignorance is supported by us. That's the connection between these three thinkers. Sartre shows we lie to ourselves to avoid the anxiety of freedom. Pascal shows we prefer not to know when knowing hurts. Shankara teaches this ignorance isn't ultimate reality. It's an illusion created by the mind, and it can be undone through awareness. But there's something even more unsettling. In an age of endless information, voluntary ignorance has become easier and more dangerous. Today, we can choose what we want to hear, filter only what confirms our beliefs, silence anything that challenges us, hide inside bubbles, algorithms, and comfortable truths. We live in the age of choice, but we often use that freedom to protect ourselves from truth. That is bad faith. That is emotional ignorance. That is digital Maya. And the effects are everywhere. Brilliant people denying scientific evidence. Educated leaders justifying absurd injustices. trained minds refusing to reflect on themselves, because voluntary ignorance isn't an intelligence problem. It's an integrity problem, a willingness to see, to feel, to change. And change requires letting go of the comfort of being right, letting go of the mask of perfection, letting go of the protection of illusion. That's why the antidote isn't collecting more information. It's practicing self-awareness, asking yourself every day, what am I avoiding seeing? Where in my life am I choosing ignorance? What truths threaten me? And that's why I run from them. Those questions are the beginning of wisdom, not the kind that shines in books, but the kind that transforms your soul. Because real knowledge isn't what makes you more admired. It's what makes you more free. As Shankara said, when ignorance ends, what remains is being. Few things are as dangerous as absolute certainty. Certainty about what's right. Certainty about what's true. Certainty about who's wrong. It sounds contradictory. Isn't certainty what we seek through knowledge? Doesn't it give us safety, stability, power? But the history of philosophy and of humanity itself shows that too much certainty can be the most disguised form of ignorance. Because when we're too sure, we stop questioning. And when we stop questioning, we stop learning. René Descartes, often considered the father of modern philosophy, understood this better than most. His starting point wasn't certainty, it was doubt. In his method, Descartes proposed doubting everything. Anything that could be deceptive, uncertain, or illusory should be put on hold. Only what could survive doubt would be accepted as a solid foundation for knowledge. That's where his famous line comes from. I think, therefore I am. But what many people miss is that this sentence is the result of doubt, not certainty. It's what remains after everything has been tested. Descartes wasn't a hopeless skeptic. He wanted to rebuild knowledge on solid ground. But maybe his most valuable lesson is this. Doubt is the doorway to real thinking. Absolute certainty is the end of it. And that's the danger. Because many people, after finding one strong idea, stop there. They turn knowledge into dogma, reflection into ideology, searching into defending. The result? A mind that repeats but doesn't renew, that argues but doesn't listen. And this isn't limited to philosophy. Science struggles with it too. Politics, religion, art. Any area can be infected by too much certainty. Smart, well-educated, clear-minded people can fall into this trap, believing they already know enough. They already have the answers. There's nothing left to explore. And little by little, intelligence turns into rigidity. Zen Buddhism points directly at this, just in a different way. For Zen masters, logic isn't enough. The rational mind, no matter how useful, is limited, and real awakening requires going beyond it. That's why Zen monks created koans, paradoxical riddles, questions with no logical answer like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Without opening your mouth, how do you speak the truth? These lines aren't meant to be solved. They exist to break the logical mind, to push the person out of certainty and into direct experience. Zen understands that a mind clinging to logic loses insight. It becomes trapped in words, systems, concepts. And insight, that moment of deep clarity, awakening, often happens exactly when logic fails, when certainty collapses, when the mind finally gives in to silence. It's an invitation into emptiness, into not knowing, into the radical humility of saying, I don't know, and that's okay. In that sense, too much certainty blinds us to the more subtle layers of reality. It keeps us from seeing mystery, poetry, symbolism. It makes us mechanical, predictable, reactive. Giambattista Vico, an 18th century Italian philosopher, criticized exactly this, a kind of rationality that excludes imagination. For Vico, pure reason, when separated from history, culture, and poetic language, creates a sterile intellectual, someone who understands formulas but doesn't understand human beings. who analyzes data but can't grasp meaning. Vico valued historical, mythical, symbolic knowledge. He believed the biggest truths aren't expressed only through logical arguments, but through metaphor, stories, and art. And he worried about the rise of a science that thought it could explain everything with numbers, because that soulless certainty could kill wisdom. And he was right. We live in an era where everything needs evidence, proof, logic. But we forget that the deepest parts of life don't fit inside equations. Love, death, pain, meaning. These things aren't proven, they're lived. And too much certainty keeps us from going into them fully. What connects Descartes, the Zen masters, and Vico is this: an awareness of the limits of reason. Descartes used doubt to build solid knowledge. Zen uses paradox to dissolve the rational ego. Vico uses imagination to recover forgotten ways of knowing. And all of them, in different ways, warn us about the trap of certainty. Because certainty is comfortable. It gives us power. It gives us status. It protects us from insecurity. But it also isolates us, hardens us, makes us arrogant, and worse, it makes us predictable. A person who is too certain doesn't listen anymore. They answer before they hear, judge before they understand. They live at war with anything that threatens their mental map. That's why doubt, far from weakness, is a sign of maturity. Doubting yourself, revisiting convictions, questioning what seems obvious. That's what keeps thought alive. That's what separates the wise person from the fanatic. Because the wise person says, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's another way to see it. Maybe I need to listen more. And the fanatic says, I know. And if you don't agree, you're wrong. Fanaticism isn't only political. It can be scientific, religious, philosophical, even spiritual. Any absolute certainty, when it becomes a trench, becomes dangerous. And ironically, the smarter someone is, the more armed they can be with their certainties, more able to justify, argue, win debates. And maybe further from the truth. Because truth isn't something you conquer. It's something you pursue, share, and above all, listen for. You've probably met someone very intelligent. Someone who could explain the world with precision, quote authors from memory, and shine in arguments. But in real life, they made bad decisions, didn't know how to deal with people, and stumbled over simple conflicts. That's the paradox of modern intelligence. We know more and more, but we live less and less. Because theoretical intelligence by itself isn't wisdom. And without practical wisdom, even the brightest mind can act in deeply foolish ways. Aristotle, one of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, made this distinction clearly. He called Sophia theoretical wisdom, connected to contemplation, the search for first causes, and abstract knowledge. And he called phronesis practical wisdom, the ability to act well in real life, to make ethical decisions in concrete situations. For him, a truly wise person is someone who combines both. Without phronesis, knowledge becomes an ivory tower. It becomes a luxury of the study. It becomes beautiful speech, but empty of action. Aristotle went further. He said ethics isn't theoretical knowledge. You learn it by living, choosing, making mistakes, and reflecting on your own actions. That's why so many intelligent people are deep down unskilled. They know what's right, but don't do it. They know how to solve things, but avoid facing them. They know how to give advice, but don't live what they preach. That happens when knowledge stays in the head and never reaches the heart and the hands. Confucius, on the other side of the world, taught the same lesson more than 2,000 years ago. For him, the truly wise person wasn't the one who knew the most, but the one who lived with integrity. Confucius said the goal of study wasn't prestige or intellectual dominance. It was the cultivation of virtue, respect, justice, kindness, humility. And more than that, he believed wisdom only has value when it shows up in everyday life, in how we treat our parents, in how we respond to injustice, in how we carry ourselves around others, even in small gestures. Studying without reflecting is useless. Reflecting without acting is dangerous. Confucius. That line captures a modern problem perfectly. A lot of people study and study and study, but never turn that study into life. They reflect, philosophize, debate, but they don't practice. And that creates a sterile kind of intelligence. The kind that impresses in speeches, but fails in human relationships. Because practical wisdom is emotional. It's ethical. It's embodied. It's the kind of knowledge you can see in someone's eyes, in their decisions, in their presence. And this isn't anti-intellectual. It's simply remembering that knowledge is only complete when it touches existence. William James, a 19th century American philosopher and psychologist, created a school of thought called pragmatism that pushed this idea to the limit. For him, ideas only matter if they produce real effects. A theory can look beautiful on paper, but if it doesn't change life, improve the world, or touch reality, it's hollow. James believed thinking should be a tool in the service of life. And truth, far from being an abstract concept, is what works, what proves meaningful in practice. Of course, he didn't reject the search for pure knowledge, but he insisted that philosophy and any form of knowledge must bow to experience. It should come from life and return to it. Today, though, we live at the other extreme. We train specialists who know everything about one small point, but can't navigate basic human dilemmas. They know how a system works, but they don't know how to talk to a friend in crisis. They know every grammar rule, but they don't know how to listen to someone's pain. That isn't stupidity. It's disconnection. It's the absence of practical wisdom. And the worst part is, it's taught. From early on, we're trained to memorize formulas, collect titles, compete for recognition. But we're not trained to live well, to listen, to choose, to say no, to deal with mistakes, with other people, with time. The result? Adults with trained minds and illiterate hearts, people who know everything about the world, but don't know how to live inside it. Think about political leaders who have no real human sense of reality, teachers who look down on their students, activists who shout for justice but practice intolerance. That's a lack of phronesis. It's the split between knowing and being. And maybe the greatest tragedy of modern life is this. We turned knowledge into performance, into status, into symbolic capital, and forgot that knowing is a way of being in the world. A truly wise person, as Aristotle would say, knows when to stay quiet, when to act, when to wait, when to give in. They know how to weigh circumstances. They know how to apply principles to real life. They know not everything fits into theory, and you only learn that by living. Practical wisdom is a continuous practice. Self-knowledge, watching the world, humility in the face of complexity. That's why the ancients valued experience so much. Because it shapes character. Because it teaches what no book can teach. An Eastern proverb says, knowing 100 theories about the sea doesn't teach you how to swim. And maybe the biggest mistake smart people make is thinking, knowledge is enough. But it isn't. Knowing anger is harmful doesn't stop you from exploding. Knowing ego gets in the way doesn't make you humble. Knowing empathy matters doesn't make you empathetic. You have to move from knowing to being. And that takes practice, presence, commitment, and it takes failure. Because practical wisdom isn't gained only by winning. It often grows out of stumbling, making mistakes, and revising yourself. Aristotle knew that. Confucius lived it. William James reshaped it. And what about us? Do we have the courage to apply what we know? Do we have the humility to admit we still don't know how to live well? Because in the end, wisdom isn't defined by how much you know. It's defined by how well you live what you know. We live in an era where the self is worshipped like a god. Social media teaches us to build an image, not an identity. The performance culture rewards people who sell themselves well, not necessarily people who are real. And the modern world, while promising autonomy, often delivers vanity instead. We've never talked so much about self-esteem, and we've never been so insecure. Because there's a difference between knowing yourself and worshipping yourself. That's the subtle poison of the ego. It dresses up as confidence, but it feeds on comparison. It looks like strength, but it hides a fragility that can't exist without applause. And the strangest part is that this cult of the ego doesn't only affect shallow, obviously vain people. It corrupts smart people too, educated people, academics, the enlightened. People who believe their intelligence makes them special, or worse, superior. Spinoza, the 17th century rationalist philosopher, was one of the first to expose the ego's illusion in a deep way. For him, the ego, this idea of a separate, independent me in control of itself, is a constant source of error and suffering. Spinoza saw clearly that human beings, driven by passions, often confuse desire with reason. In other words, we use logic to justify what we already want emotionally. We say, this is right, but deep down, we mean, this is convenient for me. From this view, the ego blinds us. It makes it look like we're thinking rationally, when we're really just defending our desires. That's why the ego is so dangerous for a brilliant mind, because it uses intelligence like a shield to prove it's right, to win arguments, to build an identity of moral, aesthetic, or intellectual superiority. But Spinoza points to another way. The wise person isn't the one who fights passions, but the one who understands their causes. For him, self-knowledge isn't empty introspection, it's analysis. It's seeing where your impulses come from, understanding why you react the way you do, escaping the prison of what I want so you can live with more clarity and ethics. Without that, intelligence turns into vanity, and thinking, instead of freeing you, enslaves you. Centuries before Spinoza, the Buddha reached an even more radical conclusion. The self doesn't exist. In Buddhist philosophy, the self we believe we are, fixed, stable, separate from the world, is an illusion, a mental construction made of memories, desires, fears, and habits, a bundle of experiences the mind stitches together as if it were one solid identity. But when you look closely, there's no fixed self to find. There's no unchanging center. Everything is in motion. Everything changes. And it's attachment to this imaginary self that creates suffering. Where there is ego, there is pain, the Buddha teaches. Because the ego always wants more recognition, more control, more certainty, a bigger gap between me and everyone else. And when it doesn't get that, suffering shows up: frustration, envy, anger, sadness, wounded pride. The Buddha offers the opposite path of ego worship, the dissolving of the self, not by erasing personality, but by recognizing it is impermanent and interconnected. I'm not only me, I'm what I eat, what I think, what I feel. I'm time, culture, encounters. I'm the other person too, and that realization is freeing, because where the ego says, this is mine, wisdom says, this is temporary. Where the ego says, this is who I am, wisdom says, that's a construction. This pulls us off the center stage, and in doing so, brings us back to reality. It's a lesson we desperately need in a world that confuses ego with identity, that turns the search for authenticity into a theater of vanity, that calls something self-realization when it's often just addiction to self-image. Michel de Montaigne, the French Renaissance thinker, also deeply distrusted the ego, especially the intellectual ego. In his famous essays, Montaigne practiced self-knowledge through writing, but not to glorify himself, to examine himself, to show that even the most educated person is full of flaws, contradictions, and vanity. He said, "No one is free from saying foolish things. The problem is saying them with confidence." It's a direct critique of intellectual pride, the arrogance of someone who thinks that because they've read a lot or argue well, they're above being wrong. Montaigne offered the opposite: active humility, a mind that watches itself, a mind that doesn't take itself so seriously, knowledge that admits it doesn't know. That's why he wrote so personally, showing his habits, fears, weaknesses, because he knew that only by exposing the ego can we deflate it. And that's the key. The ego feeds on what stays hidden, on what we pretend isn't there, on what we want to hide from ourselves. But when we bring it into the light, it loses power. Spinoza calls that understanding the causes. The Buddha calls it letting go of attachment. Montaigne calls it laughing at yourself. 3 languages. 1 path, shrinking the ego to expand awareness. Because where the ego rules, intelligence serves it, and everything becomes a contest. Everything becomes territory. Everything becomes defense, never dialogue. But when the ego loses the throne, intelligence can finally bloom. It can listen. It can question itself. It can learn from others. It can make mistakes and grow. In the end, maybe that's what separates the wise from the clever. The clever use knowledge to protect themselves. The wise use knowledge to transform themselves. And there's no transformation without humility, without letting go of self-image, without giving up the I know, without the courage to say, I'm still a mystery to myself. This is an age of ideas, theories, models, abstractions, speeches. But there's a problem that's becoming impossible to ignore. We think a lot and live very little. The mind is overstimulated, but the body is disconnected. Real, concrete, living experience has been replaced by screens, formulas, and opinions. And in the middle of all that, even the smartest people get lost. Because intelligence, when it rejects experience, becomes useless. It stops touching reality and starts spinning around itself. John Locke, one of the foundations of modern empiricism, said it clearly. There is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. For him, the human mind is born like a blank slate. Everything we know, everything we understand, everything we think comes from experience. Locke didn't reject reason, but he said the base of knowledge is sensory: touch, smell, pain, images, sounds, what we feel, live through, and survive. And when an intellectual tries to think without that base, what they build is a castle in the air. Maybe beautiful, definitely complex, but without a foundation. That's why so many brilliant ideas fail in practice, because they were created by people who isolated themselves from real life, who forgot the ground, who chose concepts over lived experience. And when that happens, philosophy turns into doctrine, art turns into technique, science turns into dehumanized calculation, and thought, which should connect us to the world, becomes a wall. More than 2,000 years before Locke, Heraclitus, the philosopher of flow, warned about this. Everything flows. You can't step into the same river twice. The world is fire in motion. For him, reality is constant change. And wisdom comes from observing what changes, from entering the experience of impermanence. Heraclitus didn't believe in fixed ideas. He believed real knowledge comes from contact with a living, changing world, from listening, paying attention to the present, and watching the cycles of life. But the arrogant intellectual who lives only in theories doesn't see that. They try to freeze the world into definitions. They want to label everything, control what escapes them, and by doing that, they lose what matters most. Because the world doesn't bend to logic. Life doesn't fit into categories. A human being is not a chart. When you reject experience, you're not just rejecting the senses, you're rejecting reality itself. You run from pain, doubt, and unpredictability. But those are part of life. Experience is what shapes us. It can wound us, but it also teaches us. It can shake us, but it also reveals things we couldn't see before. And the truly wise person doesn't run from that. They go in, they feel, they learn from what they live. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, said, The wise person lives according to nature. For the Stoics, living according to nature didn't mean isolating yourself in lofty thoughts. It meant aligning yourself with reality as it is, accepting what you can't change, acting with courage where you can make a difference, and finding steadiness in the middle of chaos. For Zeno, knowledge must be born from direct experience, from encounters, losses, hard choices, because virtue shows up through contact with the world, not by escaping it. A real Stoic doesn't run from pain. They face it. They don't deny the body. They listen to it. They don't avoid experience. They turn it into wisdom. But today we're trained to do the opposite. We're trained to avoid discomfort, numb pain, control everything, and theorize about things we've never actually lived. That's why we often hear empty advice from educated people, ideas disconnected from human reality, motivational talks that have never touched anyone's real sadness. Because knowledge that doesn't touch life is empty, and thinking that refuses feeling is fragile. A philosopher who doesn't feel the world doesn't truly think the world. They repeat ideas, but they don't create. They don't understand. They don't live. Experience is the test ground of truth. It's where we find out if an idea works, if an ethic is livable, if a worldview is actually human. Without that, everything becomes speculation. And speculation without the body, without time, without pain, is just noise. That's the difference between a theorist and a wise person. The theorist explains what they read. The wise person shares what they lived. And you don't have to be old to have wisdom. You just have to be present, with attention, openness, and the courage to feel. That's what Heraclitus pointed to. That's what Locke understood. That's what Zeno lived. The knowledge that matters is the kind that went through your skin, that passed through fear, that faced not knowing, that looked doubt in the eyes, and kept going. Today, many people confuse experience with opinion. They think living means just having a point of view. But experience isn't shouting. It's listening. It's being fully present in a moment, noticing the body's signals, watching impermanence without panic, accepting that not everything will be understood, but it can be felt. As a Zen saying puts it, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. In other words, wisdom lives in the simple things, in repetition, in practice, in real life. The intellectual who rejects experience because they're afraid of being contaminated loses contact with what matters most, and even if they know all the great authors, they become a stranger in their own life. So maybe it's time to relearn, to listen to the body again, respect time, look people in the eye, and be present. Because as Locke taught, all knowledge begins in experience. And as Heraclitus reminded us, life is movement, and if you don't watch the flow, you get lost. And as Zeno practiced, wisdom is living in harmony with reality, not running from it. Being intelligent isn't the same as being free, because a mind can be brilliant and still be cowardly. Cowardly in front of public opinion, cowardly in front of the group, cowardly in front of the need to be accepted. That's the drama of social conformity. It isn't ignorance that traps you. It's the fear of being different. We're surrounded by other people's ideas, by invisible rules, by collective expectations that, without us even noticing, shape our decisions, our words, and our silences. And even the most educated, the most critical, the most enlightened people can fall into this game. Alexis de Tocqueville, a 19th century French thinker, observed this with sharp clarity. He said that even in free democracies, the majority can exercise a subtle but powerful kind of tyranny, the tyranny of public opinion. According to Tocqueville, modern society doesn't need chains. It uses the look on people's faces. It uses laughter, contempt, isolation, and that's why, even in times of freedom, people avoid thinking differently. Because thinking differently is risky. It can cost you your reputation, your stability, your sense of belonging. And for many people, that feels unbearable. Tocqueville wasn't only talking about ignorant crowds. He was talking about refined minds that bend to consensus just to avoid disapproval. Thinkers who soften their ideas to please. Leaders who give in to mediocrity because they're afraid of losing applause. It's the tyranny of the majority, not through violence, but through emotional pressure. And it's even more effective because it doesn't look like tyranny. It disguises itself as common sense, as moderation, as the right attitude. And little by little, authentic thinking gets suffocated. Hannah Arendt, one of the most clear-eyed philosophers of the 20th century, pushed this idea even further, with a disturbing warning. For her, extreme evil can be born from ordinary obedience, from a mind that stops thinking and simply follows orders. In her work on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the organizers of the Holocaust, Arendt didn't find a monster. She found an employee, a bureaucrat, a regular man who claimed he was just following orders. That's when she coined the phrase that shaped modern political thought: the banality of evil. Evil isn't always fueled by hatred. Sometimes it's fueled by the absence of thought, by conformity, by obedience without reflection, by giving up moral judgment in the name of duty, hierarchy, and what feels normal. And the scariest part? This doesn't require ignorance. Intelligent, educated, civilized people have committed some of the worst crimes in history simply because they stopped thinking. Arendt's warning is clear. Real evil begins when we stop asking, "Is this right?" When we just repeat, follow, and execute. That's why conformity is so dangerous. It doesn't present itself as evil. It presents itself as safety, stability, belonging. But the cost is your soul, your inner freedom, your ethical responsibility. And what's even sadder is that conformity often dresses up like virtue. We call silence in the face of injustice respect. We call cowardice in the face of lies politeness. We call the lack of courage to be honest moderation. More than 2,000 years ago, Confucius understood this dilemma. For him, the truly noble person, the Yunzi, stays loyal to virtue even when the whole world turns away from it. Confucius saw society as a field of mutual influence. He knew people are shaped by their environment, but he also believed integrity is not negotiable. The petty person is carried by the group. The noble person stays with virtue, even if alone. That line captures the difference between wisdom and conformity. The conformist asks, "What are people saying? What is acceptable? What do I risk if I disagree?" The wise person asks, "Is this just? Is this true? Does this honor my conscience?" And that courage doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from self-knowledge, from knowing that deep values don't change with the wind of opinion. The Confucian noble person doesn't need the approval of the majority because they are guided by something internal, by a sense of honor that doesn't depend on applause. Today, sadly, that ideal is rare. We live in a culture that preaches authenticity but punishes people who think differently, that celebrates freedom but cancels the dissenter, that claims to value debate but only tolerates agreement. The result? People who adjust their beliefs to the room, who say what's expected, who hide what they think, who stay quiet because it's convenient. And the worst part is that many of these people are intelligent, capable, educated, but the fear of rejection becomes stronger than loyalty to truth, and that slowly destroys moral courage. As Tocqueville suggests, the tyranny of the majority doesn't hurt the body, it hurts freedom of conscience. As Arendt warns, evil doesn't begin with hatred, it begins with absent thinking. As Confucius teaches, true value is the ability to resist, even when no one else resists. So the question that remains is, what price are you willing to pay to be free? Because real freedom demands sacrifice. It demands going against the group. It demands surviving isolation. It demands saying no when everyone else says yes. And that courage doesn't come from slogans. It comes from a living critical mind, an awake soul, and a heart that chooses integrity over comfort. So before you repeat the opinion of the moment, before you stay silent just to fit in, before you change your mind just to be accepted, ask yourself, is this who I am or who they expect me to be? That question may sound simple, but it's the beginning of freedom, and maybe also the beginning of wisdom. We live in an era that praises the mind but looks down on the body. We're trained to think, calculate, plan, but we forget how to feel, breathe, and be present. Intelligence has become a synonym for speed, productivity, and abstraction. And the more we climb the intellectual ladder, the more we drift away from the ground, from the body, from everyday life, from real life. And that distance has a cost: anxiety, exhaustion, chronic dissatisfaction, because a mind that doesn't live inside the body can't truly rest. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a 20th century French philosopher, was one of the thinkers who most strongly criticized this split. For him, consciousness isn't something floating above the world. It's rooted in the body. We are a thinking body, conscious flesh. Ignoring that means losing contact with lived reality. For Merleau-Ponty, intelligence isn't only logic, it's perception. It's in how we see, touch, move, in how we walk into a room, feel the texture of a cup, listen to someone's breathing. All of that is knowledge. All of that is presence. But modern life separated body and mind. It created the myth of pure rationality, as if thinking could happen without smell, without weight, without hunger, without time. And that's how disembodied intellectuals are born. People who think a lot, but don't know how to live. They can theorize about love, but can't truly hug someone. They know everything about ethics, but can't wait in line with patience. This disconnection is subtle. It shows up when we forget to care for the body, when we eat out of anxiety, sleep poorly, breathe on autopilot. It shows up when we treat everyday life like an obstacle instead of part of existence. But the body is where everything happens. It's in the body that we feel joy, pain, fear, pleasure. It's where the soul lives. And if we don't inhabit the body, we're always absent. Zen Buddhism understands this with deep wisdom. For Zen masters, awakening isn't found in grand thoughts, it's found in simple actions. Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. This line, repeated for centuries in monasteries, breaks our expectations. It teaches that the sacred isn't beyond daily life, it's inside it. Washing a bowl with attention, walking barefoot with awareness, drinking tea in silence. All of that is spiritual practice. Zen doesn't reject thought. It just reminds us that the mind should be where the body is, and that the deepest knowledge isn't expressed in words, but in presence. A Zen master might spend years teaching nothing but posture, breathing, and silence, because they know truth isn't something you understand. It's something you experience, and to experience it, you have to be fully there. But today, we do the opposite. We live on autopilot, thinking about the future while we eat, thinking about the past while we walk, never where we are, never in the now. And that pulls us out of life. We get trapped in a mental world full of plans, lists, theories, but empty of real sensory experience. That absence drains us, and deep down, it leaves us unhappy. Epicurus, a philosopher from ancient Greece, saw this clearly. For him, the good life isn't about complicated theories. It's about moderate, concrete, simple pleasure. Epicurus is often misunderstood as a shallow hedonist, but his teaching is the opposite of excess. He spoke of lasting, peaceful pleasure, rooted in the present. For Epicurus, real happiness lives in things like eating with moderation and gratitude, talking with friends honestly, feeling the breeze on your face, sleeping well, walking without rushing. None of that requires status, recognition, or intellectual achievement. If you want to be rich, reduce your desires, Epicurus said. For him, wisdom is enjoying what's already within reach, right now, in the body, in simplicity. But the worship of intelligence taught us the opposite. It taught us pleasure is in achievement, happiness is in big accomplishments, value is in abstractions. So we live in escape mode, escaping stillness, escaping slowness, escaping the everyday. We start believing thinking is more important than living. Knowing is more valuable than feeling. Being intellectual means rejecting the ordinary, but life happens in the ordinary. Washing dishes, cooking a meal, saying good morning with kindness. That is practical wisdom. That is embodied philosophy. As Merleau-Ponty would say, the world isn't a concept, it's a presence. And being present may be the greatest act of intelligence we can practice. So maybe the most urgent question today isn't, what do you know? But, are you present where you are? Are your mind and your body in the same place? Do you know how to breathe? Because without that, all knowledge is blind. Every theory is dry. Every speech is empty. Knowledge that ignores the body is arrogant. Knowledge that looks down on daily life is foolish. But knowledge that roots itself in the present, respects the rhythm of things, and values the simple, that kind of knowledge is fertile. It's sensitive. It's transformative. It's the kind of knowledge that actually nourishes life. Talking about death is uncomfortable. That's why most people avoid it. We run, distract ourselves, collect things, plan. But deep down, we know it's there. It always has been. It always will be. The problem is that avoiding this fact doesn't make it less real. If anything, it makes us less real. Because when we ignore death, we live as if life were endless, as if every mistake could be fixed later, as if every conversation could be postponed, as if time had no limit. But it does. Martin Heidegger, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, said, "Being toward death is the condition for an authentic life." For him, living authentically isn't about chasing security, it's about facing finitude. It's recognizing that life is limited, fragile, temporary, and that's exactly why it has value. Death, for Heidegger, isn't a distant event, it's a presence. It shows up in loss, in endings, in aging, in silence, and living while ignoring that reality is living inauthentically. It's living in denial, hiding inside distractions, empty goals, and automatic routines. Even highly intelligent people fall into this trap. Because technical knowledge, degrees, status, none of that replaces the courage to face the end. A person can know everything about the world, but if they never think about death, they're living in illusion. The illusion of control, the illusion of immortality, the illusion that there's always more time. But when death enters our awareness, something changes. Life gains shape, choices gain weight, time becomes precious. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher of ancient Rome, wrote, "To meditate on death is to free yourself from foolish worries." For him, thinking about death isn't morbid, it's liberating, because it forces us to ask, what really matters? If I died today, what would I regret? What am I delaying out of fear or distraction? Seneca saw death as an ethical standard, a mirror for our vanity, a lens that shows what is superficial and what is essential. He said, "Are you afraid of death? Then maybe you're afraid you've lived badly." That's the hard truth many people avoid. We don't fear death itself. We fear realizing we didn't live the way we should have. We fear looking back and seeing wasted time, seeing how often we stayed silent, seeing how trapped we were in vanity, in fights, in things that, now, look ridiculous. Death exposes how small many daily worries are. Wounded pride, comparisons, accumulation. And that's why remembering death doesn't depress us. It wakes us up. It brings us back to the present. It calls us into real presence. It gives us the urgency to live fully. In the Hindu Vedic tradition, there's a powerful image, Yama, the god of death. Yama isn't an enemy. He isn't a monster. He's a teacher, someone who teaches, with severity and compassion, that life is a passage and everything that begins ends. Everything born will die. Everything built will eventually fall apart. Ignoring Yama, ignoring death, is ignoring the deepest truth. In the Upanishads, Yama appears as a guide who reveals the meaning of existence to a student, and his first lesson is clear. Most people choose pleasure. The wise choose what is real. Because pleasure distracts us. But awareness of death wakes us up. When we accept death as part of life, different questions appear. What am I building with my time? What will I leave behind when I'm gone? Who is beside me right now, and how am I treating them? These aren't theoretical questions. They're existential. They're the only questions that truly matter, and philosophy has always had the courage to face them. Socrates said that to philosophize is to learn how to die, because when you live with death in mind, you choose more clearly. You love with more presence. You speak with more truth. But when you ignore it, you live like a sleepwalker. You believe there will always be time. You postpone everything. You trade depth for urgency. And in the end, you didn't really live. This isn't about living in fear. It's about living with awareness. Because death isn't the enemy of life. It's what makes life valuable. Just as silence gives music its shape, the ending gives meaning to everything in the middle. That's why the Stoics began the day remembering death, not as tragedy, but as clarity. That's why Buddhist monks meditate in cemeteries, to remember that everything beautiful, strong, young, will pass. That's why Hindu philosophers saw Yama as a teacher, not as punishment, because death isn't a curse. It's part of the cycle, and ignoring it is living only half a life. Today, maybe more than ever, we're trained to pretend death doesn't exist. Cosmetics, surgeries, toxic optimism, non-stop productivity, endless goals, endless distractions. But the emptiness stays, because without finitude, nothing has weight. There's no depth without limits, no real presence without awareness of absence, no real love without the risk of loss. The obsession with living longer didn't save us from anxiety, because living long isn't the same as living well. Philosophy teaches that a good life isn't the longest one, it's the most awake one. The one that has the courage to look death in the eyes and still choose life. As Montaigne said, "Whoever teaches people how to die, teaches them how to live." Maybe that's the point. We don't need to fear death. We need to learn from it. It teaches us that time is sacred, that every gesture matters, that every meeting could be the last, and because of that, it should be lived with love, with wholeness, and with truth. Technology moves forward. Efficiency increases. Machines get faster. Systems get smarter. Algorithms get more precise. But somewhere along the way, we get lost. We lose touch with human experience, with empathy, with time, with ethics. Modern intelligence turns into technique and forgets what it means to be human. Max Weber, one of the major sociologists of the 20th century, called this instrumental reason, a kind of logic that organizes the means but ignores the ends. For Weber, modern life is shaped by a cold, calculating, bureaucratic rationality. Everything gets measured, evaluated, optimized. But fewer and fewer people stop to ask, for what purpose? Institutions become machines. Relationships become contracts. Work becomes a gear in the system. And the individual, a replaceable part. The danger of instrumental reason is that it separates intelligence from values. It doesn't ask whether something is fair, only whether it's efficient. It doesn't focus on what's good, only on performance. And the result is a world where political, educational, and even moral decisions are guided by charts, data, and reports. Where compassion is replaced by procedure. Listening is replaced by systems. Life is replaced by spreadsheets. Weber warned, "The iron cage of modern rationality traps the human spirit. A prison without bars, made of goals, spreadsheets, processes, productivity. Meaning disappears, and what remains is the endless maintenance of the system." And this logic is often carried forward by highly intelligent people. Brilliant technicians, efficient administrators, genius programmers, who stop thinking about the human side. Because when intelligence isn't guided by values, it becomes dangerous. History shows this clearly. Nazi concentration camps used the logic of efficiency to kill. Totalitarian regimes planned extermination with mathematical precision. Economic systems exploit, exclude, and dehumanize in the name of productivity. All very intelligent, all very technical, all deeply cruel. Jacques Ellul, a 20th century French thinker, took this critique even further. For him, technique became autonomous. Technique justifies itself, he said. In other words, today we often do something not because it is good, fair, or necessary, but because it is possible. If a technology can be created, it will be. If a system can be made more efficient, it will be implemented, even if it costs jobs, relationships, health. Ellul believed the real danger of technique isn't its existence, but its control over our thinking. It imposes its logic. It sets the pace. It defines what counts as success, value, truth, and we obey. Ellul wasn't against using technology. He was against the automation of consciousness, against the belief that everything must be optimized, that a human being is just a variable inside the system. And he believed that destroys deep thinking, real questioning, ethical reflection, the slowness needed for good judgment. Because a wise person isn't someone who masters techniques. A wise person knows when and how to use them, and when to refuse them. Mengzi, one of the great heirs of Confucian thought, said something similar more than 2,000 years ago. The mind must be in harmony with the heart. For him, technique, knowledge, calculation, practical intelligence only has value when guided by compassion. When the mind separates from the heart, when reason drifts away from humanity, cruel systems are born, cold, insensitive, unfeeling. Mencius believed every human being carries a seed of goodness, a natural impulse toward what is right. But that impulse has to be nurtured. And modern life, in the name of efficiency, has been suffocating that growth. Children learn to compete before they learn to listen. Adults are judged by targets before they're recognized as people. Governments invest in technology and cut art, philosophy, culture. The result is a world that is technically advanced but spiritually poor. Think about algorithms that decide what you see. Social media that rewards engagement, not truth. Apps that measure everything but understand nothing about who you are. We're becoming functionally intelligent and existentially empty. And the worst part is we call that progress. But progress, without a human direction, isn't evolution, it's dehumanization. Technical knowledge has to serve life, not the other way around. The mind has to serve the heart, not dominate it. And that requires wisdom, the wisdom to pause and ask, what is this for? Does this bring people closer or push them apart? Does this respect human dignity? Does this make me a better person or just a more productive one? These questions don't fit inside an algorithm, but they must fit inside conscience. Because as Ellul warned, the wise person resists automation. They know not everything that is possible should be done. Not everything efficient is good. Not every innovation is real progress. And as Mencius taught, technique without compassion is foolish. Because knowing how to do something isn't the same as knowing how to live. The intelligence that matters is the kind that builds bridges, serves justice, welcomes people in, and cares. And you don't learn that in manuals. You learn it through listening, reflection, and ethical experience. So the challenge isn't to abandon technique, it's to put it in its proper place, at the service of life, guided by values and shaped by the heart. A human being can survive a lot: pain, loneliness, injustice. But there's one thing we can't endure for long: living without meaning. Existential emptiness doesn't scream, it goes quiet. And many times, it settles into the brightest minds, people who achieved everything, except a reason why. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, used to say, "Whoever has a why can bear almost any how." Frankl lived through the horror of Nazi concentration camps. He saw people die from hunger, cold, and violence. But he also saw something even more tragic. People who died because they couldn't see any meaning anymore. He realized it's not suffering itself that destroys you. It's suffering without purpose. A life with no direction. Empty days repeating. No sense of meaning. Out of that experience, he created logotherapy, a form of therapy centered on the search for meaning. For Frankl, mental and emotional health depends on our relationship with purpose. And this applies to everyone, including the smartest people. Because intelligence doesn't replace meaning. Sometimes a brilliant mind only makes the emptiness bigger. A genius who can't find a why is like a powerful ship with no compass, full of strength, but drifting. Today, we see this everywhere. People who are hyperconnected, productive, informed, but lost inside. And often that emptiness is hidden behind productivity, fame, status, activism, constant busyness. But all it takes is silence. A breakup, a loss, a collapse, and everything falls apart. Because without meaning, no achievement can hold you up. Albert Camus, the Algerian-born philosopher, described this as the absurdity of existence. For him, the absurd is born from the clash between our hunger for meaning and the silence of the universe. We want answers. We want direction. But the world doesn't answer. There's no map, no instruction manual. And Camus doesn't offer cheap comfort. He doesn't say, it'll pass. He doesn't say, everything happens for a reason. He looks the absurd in the face and says, the only dignified path is lucidity. And resisting the absurd is what gives life meaning. That takes courage. The courage to face the emptiness, not run from it, not numb it, not hide behind dogmas, distractions, or fake certainty. Because, as Camus warned, escaping reality can become a kind of deliberate stupidity. The intelligent person who knows life has no guaranteed meaning, but chooses to drown in shallow distractions, live on autopilot, or cover anxiety with sarcasm and cynicism. But that's a betrayal of your own awareness. It wastes the chance to build meaning, even without any promise of a universal truth. Camus didn't believe meaning is handed to us, but he believed we can create meaning through how we respond to life. Even in an absurd world, we can love. We can fight for something. We can connect. We can create beauty. That is the rebellion of a clear-eyed person, refusing despair, choosing love even in the desert. In that same direction, Rumi, the 13th century mystical poet, brings a different light. For him, meaning isn't found in the mind. It's found in the heart, in union with the divine, in love as the center of existence. Rumi said, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." There's a deep truth in that. You are not separate from life. You are life. You don't have to search for meaning outside. Meaning is already alive within you. But to hear that, you have to quiet the mind. You have to move from intellect to heart, trade control for surrender, argument for contemplation. Rumi invites a mystical experience, tears you can't explain, dances that heal, love that dissolves the ego. And in that love, meaning isn't a rational answer. It's a vibration, a presence, a merging with something larger than yourself. This is the kind of wisdom modern life often lacks. We're surrounded by data, logic, productivity, but we forget the soul needs silence. We forget we are more than a resume, more than a biography, more than a mind. We are also mystery, a breath, a sigh between two silences. And when we ignore that, life loses its brightness. That's why Frankl said, "The search for meaning is the primary motivation of a human being." Camus said, "The truly serious philosophical question is whether life is worth living." Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." 3 paths, 3 styles, 1 truth. Without meaning, there is no full life. And this isn't some philosophical luxury. It's an existential need. Meaning doesn't have to be grand. It can be simple. Caring for someone, planting something, creating beauty, serving, loving, feeling like you belong. Everyone has their own way. But what we can't do is live on autopilot, pretending life is just a game of strategies, because sooner or later, the soul demands an answer. The body demands it. The heart demands it. And then we either wake up, or we keep sleeping until there's no time left. Intelligence without meaning turns into noise, and life without purpose becomes a repeating show. No story, no emotion, no direction. That's why philosophy, at its deepest level, isn't just an exercise in logic. It's a search for meaning. And maybe the most important question today isn't what do I want or what will I achieve, but this: why is it worth being alive? If you made it this far, thank you, truly. This video was an invitation to reflect on the danger of knowledge without wisdom and intelligence without self-awareness. And if any part of it stayed with you, it's because thinking can still be a bridge, not a wall. Now I want to invite you to keep walking this path with us. Subscribe to the channel, because everything here is made with depth, respect, and purpose. Share this video with someone you believe needs to hear these ideas. Like the video, because it helps this message reach more people. And leave a comment below. Which of the 15 traps of intelligence hit you the most? Which one have you fallen into? And what did you learn from it? See you in the next video. Until then.